and welcome to this event. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Rosa Salori. I'm actually Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies here at GW Law School, and also the Director of the International Comparative Law Program. And it is my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. For those of you that don't know her, but I don't think she really needs an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. She's actually Professor Leah Calabro, and I just want to read a little bit of what she has been doing and all of the accomplishments that she has. And needless to say, we are so incredibly proud that she's our alum. Okay? Leah Calabro, she's actually working as a visiting associate professor and fellow for the International Comparative Law Program here at GW. And in this capacity, she teaches international criminal law and victims' rights in international human rights and international criminal law. And she focuses her academic research and writing on international human rights law and international criminal law, especially when it comes to victims and women's rights. She's a graduate with honors of GW Law School with a concentration in international comparative law. During her time at GW, I actually had the pleasure of meeting her as a student then. She was a Thurgood Marshall Scholar, an executive articles editor for the George Washington International Law Review, and a member of our Philip Jessup International Law Moot Court team, and also a recipient of the Judge Albert Grenadier Award. She also worked as a student attorney for the Global Network Initiative as part of the International Human Rights Clinic, in addition to working as a research assistant for Professor Sean Murphy and Ed Swain. She's also an alum of the GW Oxford International Human Rights Law Program. And prior to returning to GW, she served as a law clerk on the Special Matters Unit, Fraud Division for Catchley International Inc. She is an alum of this institution, which I'm very proud of, and she also has a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I have to say, I just want to say a few things about Professor Calabro because I work very closely with her. And there's a lot to say that I'm not going to be able to say because we want to hear from her more than me, right? She impresses us daily with her hard work, her dedication, her kindness, and her boundless talent. As most of you already know, she's teaching international criminal law this spring. She's also teaching it next fall, and she also created a new course on victims' rights and international human rights law and international criminal law that she's going to start teaching next fall. I highly recommend taking both courses. Don't miss this opportunity. And I also want to tell you that, for me, it's such a joy to see when our alums are doing fantastic work and they're succeeding and they're passionate, and they're trying to contribute to the international law field. And that's exactly what I've seen in Professor Calabro, and I'm very grateful that she has agreed to share her wonderful scholarship and experiences and research with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Remember that there's lunch in the back of the room. Professor Calabro is going to present her research, and also she will answer questions afterwards, right? So thank you so much for coming today.
Well, can everybody hear me? And everybody can see the presentation? We're all set? Okay, great. Well, so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Ms. Gloria for that very, very kind introduction. So just to kind of start out, my presentation is entitled Finding Justice for the Yazidi Women Victims of the Islamic State. The basic background for how I got interested in this was I, as a student, took Professor Dickinson's class on non-international armed conflict, and during that I wanted to really focus my area of research for her paper on women's rights and human rights. So I chose to focus on the Yazidi community, and then that narrowly tailored down into the women's experience as victims of the Islamic State. So that was my initial exposure to this topic and my initial way that I became interested in it. And then when I started my position here in July, I took the opportunity to revisit it because I think that it's a topic that is not talked about as much as it should be. I'll get into the details of the historical background, but this was an event that happened in 2014, and really no justice has come of the events that took place then, and we are now approaching 10 years later, and this has just kind of been lost in the conversation. So I want people to be more aware of what's going on, and that was my hope in bringing this scholarship forward. So also on the note of scholarship, this is going to be more of just a general research presentation rather than a paper talk, because I am reworking my paper at the moment. So to start, so the general premise for my research was to look into how to achieve justice for the Yazidi women victims of the Islamic State's organized slave trade and the various other international crimes that were committed against these women. And in doing so, I decided to analyze the existing criminal justice options, both domestic and international, as well as other avenues to justice that there's a lot more precedent for. And then that led me into looking at the viability of a less traditional path to justice, and in particular, an NGO-led mock trial. I'm working on, at the moment, incorporating more transitional justice goals and viewpoints into this analysis. That is something that I'm currently working on, so it's not quite as incorporated as I'd like it to be at this moment, but that is long-term where I hope to get this research to. And then I do want to make a note at the outset as to why I'm focusing on the Yazidi women victims. So first of all, my area of interest when it comes to research, as Ms. Leah said, is victims' rights and women's rights, so that was why I chose to focus on this group. But in addition to that, this specific community has been doubly victimized. So not only were they targeted because they were a member of this ethnic group of the Yazidis, but they were also targeted because they were women. The slave trade that was put in place was explicitly created for the purpose of enslaving this female population. So they have been extremely targeted, and I think it's worth giving them space and greater attention because of that. So to give general background before I get into the actual legal analysis of all of it, I'm sure many of you know a lot of this information already, but if you don't, I'm just going to quickly reiterate. So the Islamic State was formed in 2004 from the fragmented group of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Initially, the United States gradually increased their presence in Iraq, which caused the lesser activity, but in 2011, they resurged, and eventually they held roughly a third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. As of December 2017, they had lost 95% of their territory, and as of December 2019, then President Donald Trump had claimed that we had defeated 100% of ISIS. That is very much not the case. The Prime Minister of Iraq and Kurdistan has been quoted saying that they are still very much intact, they have lost much of their leadership, they have lost many of their capable men, but they've also managed to gain more experience and to recruit more people around them, so they should not be taken away. So where we are today is that the Islamic State continues to have presence in Syria and Iraq, and therefore that needs to be considered when we're looking at what are our avenues, what are our options to achieve justice for this community. And also the Islamic State has gained infamy for its inhumane and cruel treatment of its victims. Among its victims, of course, are the Yazidi people. So some background on this group. They are one of the oldest ethnic and religious communities in the Middle East. As of 2013, it was believed that between 550,000 to 600,000 Yazidi people lived in Iraq. And they are considered an ancient monotheistic religion. Their society is organized by a caste system. Another interesting thing to note that is important when you come to the genocide analysis and crimes against humanity analysis. In order to be a member of the Yazidi community, you must have two Yazidi parents. You cannot convert into this religion. That is the only way to be part of this community. So they have been largely misunderstood throughout history. An important background to and basis of their religion is that, yes, they are monotheistic, but they believe that this one God is represented by 7 angels. And one of these angels has a background story that is very similar to Satan's background story in Islam. Therefore, the majority Islam population in the surrounding communities kind of always misunderstood and saw them as devil worshippers, and that was their perception of this community. So they have faced persecution, discrimination, and violence for dating back to the Ottoman Empire, so basically for the majority of their existence. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a little circle on that map as to where the majority of the population of the Yazidi live, which is in the Sinjar region. So now moving to the actual events that lead us to our conversation today. So in June of 2014, the Islamic State had seized Mosul, which was really near the Sinjar region, and it was now placing the Sinjar region in between majority-controlled Syria, and now they had a larger foothold in Iraq. And so they were kind of caught in the crosstails of majority Islamic State holdings. And of course, the Islamic State has a policy of no infidels can live in territory controlled by them. They had determined that the Yazidi people were infidels. So in August of 2014, Islamic State forces from both Syria and Iraq invaded the Sinjar region. They invaded Kocha, which is one of the main villages, and then from there kind of went throughout the entire region, just taking control of this area. They faced little resistance because those who were able attempted to flee. So there were some people taking their arms to try to prevent and allow more people to escape. So there was a lot of, there wasn't too much resistance, but they were able to take this region relatively quickly. And once they did that, then they refocused their efforts on just capturing these people. So included in that was they sent mobile patrols to capture those trying to escape. So unless they made it to Doha, they were likely captured. And you can see on the map in the, where are these TV screens? In the yellow region, that's where Doha is. So they spent, after they had gained control of these areas, they were capturing Yazidis after they started to separate the men and the boys from the women and the children. And that was when these crimes really started to take hold. So initially, first thing that they did was, of course, the separation, but then they started to execute all the men and boys who refused to conform. This was often done. Also, I'm just going to give a quick trigger warning. I am going to talk about a lot of heavy stuff, a lot of horrible things that happened, so if ever you need to step out, please. But now we're going to get into that. So they started to execute these men, often done within earshot of women and children, or in front of their family members. They also initially began transferring women and girls to various sites that they had already pre-established with the intent of entering them into an expansive slave market that they had created, like I said, for this explicit purpose of enslaving the Yazidi women. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what actually happened to these women. So these are quotes from survivors of their experience. I'm going to talk about a little bit of this, but I'm also going to give a little bit more background and talk about wider, more broadly experienced occurrences. So initially, they're transported to these holding sites. In these holding sites, they're experiencing incredible trauma. Right off the bat, there was a mass killing of women, all approximately over the age of 60, at one of the temporary holding sites because these women would not be lucrative in the slave market, so they were executed. The women within the sites were treated horribly. They were given insect-infested food, forced to drink water out of toilets, stuck in overcrowded cells, and were prevented from any access to medical care. The slave trade was extensive and very systematic. These women were sold at the holding sites, at slave markets, and they even had online slave auctions. And when an Islamic State fighter purchased a woman, he was given full property rights over her. So he had the ability to sell her or gift her at will. The second quote up there says that she was sold 7 times. There's another account of a woman who was in captivity for 1 year who was sold approximately 15 times. These women were victims of unimaginable physical and mental torture for prolonged periods of time. The survivors have described being raped daily. If a woman was caught trying to escape, then she was subjected to brutal beatings and potentially gang rape as a punishment. They suffered these beatings and other sexual violence, including rape, but were refused any medical treatment as a result of these injuries. There are also accounts of women being forced to take some form of birth control. If women found themselves pregnant, they were forcibly aborted of that pregnancy. There's accounts of sterilization, accounts of mutilation, the list goes on. And beyond the physical and sexual violence these women endured, of course, there's the psychological torment that comes with all of that, and then the additional psychological torment that was laid upon them. And that came in the form of the women who were sold within children. So if that was the case, then the children were basically a pawn in this entire game. So they were used as, they were often beaten in front of the mother, or there were threats upon the children and their lives in order to ensure that the women would die. There are also accounts of women's children being killed as a form of punishment. Truly awful things. And so the last part that I'll really talk about is the verbal abuse as well. So that initial misconception of them as devil worshippers that was constantly over their heads, they were constantly berated. And additionally, they were also frequently told that the men and boys that they hadn't seen since that initial day in August of 2014 were still alive. They were still living, going about their daily lives in their community. The women could not go back. Even though these women, they knew what happened to these men, but they were just constantly being messed with and tortured in this way. I will also add, this is a part of my more recent research, there have been a lot of lasting impacts on this community and these women following liberation. So of course, everything that I just described comes with trauma, comes with PTSD, and all of the physical and mental things that come with that. But there's also been a lot of difficulty being reaccepted by their community. There have been some instances of these women being seen as having lost their purity. And so there are a lot of conversations going on within the community about how do we reintroduce those women that have survived this and have been liberated from captivity. So that is the historical background to this event that brings us here today. After knowing all of this, then it's important to go into the legal analysis, which is of course why we're here, into how we can get justice for these women. So the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry on the Syria Republic, they issued a report in 2016. They went through all of the, I think they spoke to 45 survivors, and then they did a ton of research, and they decided to analyze whether or not certain international crimes have been committed by the Islamic State. They determined that genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, as well as other human rights violations were all committed. So it's also important to note that my research is really looking at how do we get individual prosecutions, how do we hold individuals responsible for what was done to these women. Right now I'm going to be talking about kind of generally what our options are, what crimes were committed, but the reason why I say that is because I'm not really looking at whether the International Court of Justice can step in. I'm looking at more if we can have the International Criminal Court or ad hoc or domestic redress for these crimes. Those of you that know international criminal law, that probably makes sense, but if not, you can ask me questions about it at the end. So first off, we have genocide. So it's also important to note that genocide is essentially customary international law at this point. This is the definition. There are no questions on this. Syria and Iraq are party to the Genocide Convention, but because, like I just said, I'm focusing on individual prosecutions, that doesn't really come into play because I'm not looking at whether or not the ICJ can call into question Syria or Iraq on their violations of the Genocide Convention. So the UN Council found that, or the UN Commission, sorry, found that there was clear evidence of intent to destroy this group for religious reasons because they were viewed as infidels. There's also a conversation as to whether or not the Yazidis are an ethnic group or a religious group. Both are protected classes, both are protected groups under the Genocide Convention, so whatever your perception is, they still qualify and are protected by this. So this intent to destroy was clear, given that the men were mostly killed or converted, and as I said before, the only way to become Yazidi is through birth with two Yazidi parents, so they are removing the possibility of future generations of this community to come into existence. They are responsible for killing. There were mass killings of the men, the older women. Many women took their own lives in captivity or were killed by their captors. They were guilty of causing both serious bodily and mental harm through their sexual enslavement of these women. The International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda are both created case law that show that rape and sexual slavery cause serious mental and physical harm. They are also guilty of imposing conditions of life by withholding access to medical treatment and by providing inadequate nutrition. And they are guilty of imposing measures to prevent births by separating the sexes and forcing the women to take birth control, forced sterilization, and sexual mutilation in some circumstances. And then we move to look at crimes against humanity. So for a crime against humanity, you have to prove that the following acts that are enumerated were committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So first thing to point out, it's widespread or systematic. This is disjunctive, it's not conjunctive, but in this case, you can prove both. So the attack was widespread, it's encompassing hundreds of villages, it affected an entire community. The attack was also systematic, and because it was organized acts of violence committed by this group in a near identical manner by fighters across the region, the attacks were pursuant to an explicit ideology, the fact that infidels were not allowed to live within their controlled territory. That was a stated organizational policy, so therefore it was systematic. They are clearly a civilian population, and knowledge of the attack, there's no issue proving that. So when you look through the crimes that are enumerated, this is actually Article 7 of the Rome Statute, which is the International Criminal Court's statute. There is no Convention on Crimes Against Humanity at the moment, so we typically look to this as the standing definition. In its killing of Yazidi men, women, and children, they committed the crime against humanity of murder and extermination. In its sexual enslavement, and beating of Yazidi women and girls, they committed the crimes of sexual slavery, rape, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, other inhumane acts, and severe deprivation of liberty. By forcing men and boys to labor on Islamic State projects and by beating them if they refused to do so, they committed the crime of enslavement, torture, and other inhumane acts. And then lastly, given that these crimes were committed against the Yazidis on discriminatory grounds based on their religion, they of course were guilty of the crime of persecution. The only crime that's listed in the Rome Statute that is not found guilty of here is apartheid. It's the only one. And then next, we have war crimes. So this is another one that's essentially viewed as customary international law. It came from the Geneva Conventions. It's been developed over time. There is widespread acknowledgement that there's a code of conduct that must be used in non-international and international armed conflicts. So that's when crimes are often committed if it goes against that code of conduct. So here we're looking at crimes against a civilian population. You really can't do anything to civilians. So of course there are crimes here. I'm just going to give a quick example. So the summary executions of men and boys constituted a war crime of murder. The forcible transfer of the women and girls, the sexual violence and slavery, the rape, everything that was done to the women and children in this population, which all took place in the context of armed conflict and were, of course, war crimes. So that is really, can't argue with. Lastly, there is the other human rights violations. So I'm really just talking about this for additional context. Like I said, I'm looking at individual prosecutions. So this is more state versus state violations. But it's important to note that there are violations of use-coding norms, which prove that everything that they did is just internationally wrong and goes against the law of humanity. There's additional violation of international human rights law norms, like right to life, right to liberty, security of persons, freedom of religion, obviously, prohibition of slavery, human trafficking, and enforced disappearance. So that brings us to, what do we do? So I looked at various paths to justice, ones that exist, ones that may exist that we have a lot of precedent for, and then I'll get to the case study that I did. So initially I looked at the International Criminal Court. This could be a really great option, but the paths to jurisdiction are blocked. So we have 4 ways that they could have jurisdiction. One is through territory, one is through over the perpetrators, one is through submission, one is through the UN Security Council. So we'll go through those. First, neither Syria nor Iraq are party to the Rome Statute, which automatically means that the ICC does not have territorial jurisdiction. It does not have jurisdiction over the perpetrators because the perpetrators are not citizens of a party state. And then, neither Syria nor Iraq have submitted to the ICC jurisdiction. What this means is a non-party state can give a submission to the ICC saying, from this date to this date, under these circumstances, we give the ICC jurisdiction to look into what's happening. They do not do that. And then the last option, of course, is the Security Council referral. And so this essentially means that the UN Security Council would pass a resolution to refer crimes committed in a certain situation in a certain country to the ICC prosecutor. This was attempted, but in 2014, Russia and China both blocked the resolution referring these crimes to the prosecutor. I do want to make a note that if ever jurisdiction becomes plausible, this is still a really great opportunity. This is still a really great route that could be accessed. And the prosecutor has found grounds and evidence to suggest that all these crimes were committed, so the groundwork has been laid. So if ever that jurisdiction becomes possible, they can jump right in there and they can start pressing charges and sending out arrest warrants. So that is an option, hopefully at some point, but at the moment it is blocked. Then we have the potential of creating an ad hoc tribunal. So we have a lot of precedent for something like this. We have the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. There are many, many other both special courts, mixed tribunals, ad hoc tribunals that provide an example. The major obstacle here is where and how we are going to establish it, and also the drafting of the guiding statute. So looking at the examples that I just mentioned, the ICTY and ICTR were both established by the UN Security Council. Like I just said, Russia and China were not okay with the ICC referral. So the odds of them voting in favor of creating an ad hoc tribunal to address these issues are not great. And then the Special Court for Sierra Leone itself requested that the UN create this tribunal and address these crimes. Syria and Iraq have not done anything to address these international issues, so the chances of them doing that are also very slim. So that brings us to the domestic court options. So here there's like a few different ways that there could be something coming of it. First, in the region, we have Syria and Iraq could potentially do something about it. Syria because that's where they're being abused, and Iraq because that's where they were taken captive. The major obstacle here is that there still are security concerns in the region. There are concerns about whether or not a prosecution could go forward without the concern of corruption or the safety of the victims. And additionally, Iraq is trying Islamic State actors using counterterrorism laws. And so this is basically just focusing on the prosecution of membership in the group of ISIS, as opposed to the specific crimes being committed. So because Iraq is not part of the Rome Statute, the egregious crimes that these ISIS actors have committed against these women are not codified in Iraqi law, which means that they can't be prosecuted there for the crimes that are actually being committed against these women. So these women still are not getting justice for what happened to them because, yes, maybe one of their abusers has been prosecuted for membership, but there's no real acknowledgement or punishment for the actual things that were done to them. Also, furthermore, the government has not been super discerning in its prosecutions of membership. So some people, the international community has started to be concerned as to whether or not this is revenge rather than justice. That has been a conversation. But that, again, doesn't really address the issue at hand as to how we get justice for these women. Another option is to bring perpetrators before domestic courts of third-party countries. This would mean countries such as Spain, Germany, etc., that have nationals that are partaking in these activities. The issue here, the ICC actually also considered this, but they determined that the high-level actors in the Islamic State are all Iraqi or Syrian nationals. So by prosecuting individuals from these countries, it doesn't actually get to the heart of the matter, so it potentially, especially for the ICC, could be a waste of resources because they have very limited resources. And for these countries, they're not actually achieving the real crux of the issue. So that is a possibility, but it's not likely that it's going to really create a huge, it's not addressing the majority of the problem. So the other domestic court option we have is universal jurisdiction. I'm a huge proponent of universal jurisdiction. We gotta just get that with the disclaimer. So universal jurisdiction allows domestic courts in any country to properly exercise jurisdiction over certain crimes. They have to be egregious international crimes, regardless of where the events take place, the nationality of the victim, and the nationality of the defendant. So the premise for why this is allowed is that these crimes are so horrendous and so awful that they are violations of the laws of humanity, and that the people committing these crimes are enemies of all mankind, so therefore anyone can have jurisdiction over them. Germany has had a universal jurisdiction statute in place since 2002, and they have used this jurisdiction to prosecute and convict several former Islamic State members for crimes against the Yazidi community. So that is one success story. But there's just Germany. There's a lot of downsides to this as well. Countries must have a statute in their domestic code of law allowing them to exercise universal jurisdiction, and then they also have to have a codified each of the crimes, so in their domestic criminal code. That can lead to major gaps in accountability because different countries can have different definitions of these crimes. So for instance, the crime of torture, different countries have different perceptions, different definitions for what that means. So there could be a really major gap in accountability for a country exercising its universal jurisdiction over an individual and maybe not seeing certain acts that they committed as counted as torture, whereas under the international definition, it absolutely would have been. There's also an issue of universal jurisdiction being perceived as an infringement upon sovereignty of the country where these acts took place. I still think universal jurisdiction is a really great option. There's also the concern of states still feeling threatened by the Islamic State, still being concerned about, okay, if we start this prosecution, are we potentially putting ourselves and our national security at risk? So there's also that consideration because, like I said, this is still a group that is a threat in our global landscape. Really quickly, two other avenues that I looked at were truth commissions and community-based justice options. These they're kind of hard to talk through because they are established in really specific ways to the specific context of what's happening, as well as the desires and goals of the community that is using them. So for instance, a truth commission can recommend policy changes. They can also work in tandem with criminal prosecutors to pave the way for future prosecutions. If we're looking at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the example, they can also grant amnesty to perpetrators who admit their guilt. So of course, this really depends on what the community would hope for and want. Community-based justice options, we can look at like the Rwanda Gacaca courts, where they basically use local conflict resolution traditions with a modern punitive legal system to deliver justice. The goal of the courts was to focus on local community by being able to distribute justice quickly and then turn their attention to reconciliation and growth and moving forward. So these have different goals, and it would have to be a conversation with the Yazidi women and the Yazidi community as to whether or not they would want to pursue those, but those are options. So lastly, what I looked at was, I looked into essentially a case study on the free and comfort women finding justice for the crimes that were committed against them. So quick background on the comfort women system. During Japan's campaign in China, during the Sino-Japanese War into World War II, Japanese military leaders installed comfort stations in the territories that they held. One of the reasons was to prevent the spread of venereal disease, which they felt was running rampant in the local brothels. They also wanted to prevent mass rape of the local populations. So the leaders in charge of these stations decided to, rather than use local women because there were concerns about how that would look, and also they could potentially return spies, they conducted what they called a recruitment campaign in other territories that they occupied, such as Korea. They essentially kidnapped women and then brought them to these comfort stations and forced them to serve as sex slaves. So Japan, to this day, says that the recruitment of these women was voluntary and that they all consented to their participation. The women have never accepted that because that's just not true. The women have attempted to bring countless lawsuits in Japan, but to no avail. So eventually they sought out an alternative method of justice, and that led to the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, which took place in December of 2000. So this tribunal, it was organized by, of course, the women, the survivors of the comfort women system, in tandem with the NGO Violence Against Women in War Network. And so they went through this whole process of creating an organizing committee, which consisted of 3 groups, one representing the victimized countries, one representing Japan, and then one serving as an international advisory committee, which had members of countries from all over the world. And so essentially what they did is they followed the same system as to how they created an ad hoc tribunal. So the organizing committee drafted a charter. They enumerated that had jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, which would include sex crimes. They expressly specified this because they felt that the military tribunal for the Far East, which took place at the end of World War II, also known as the Tokyo Tribunal, did not do a satisfactory job of addressing sex crimes. They also ensured to list Emperor Hirohito among the accused responsible because his name was very blatantly missing at the Tokyo tribunals. So they ensured that all of their jurisdiction was laid out, with the crimes, the definitions, everything was laid out in the charter. They also required that the judges determine guilt or innocence. They made a little exception because they acknowledged the fact that a lot of evidence had been destroyed since the time that this took place, so they also could determine an indeterminate verdict. The other thing that the organizing committee did was that they recruited high-level female international attorneys to serve as prosecutors. So they really wanted a lot of international acknowledgement, a lot of international buy-in, so that was kind of what they were hoping with. One of these prosecutors was Patricia Sellers, who actually was my international criminal law professor. She's incredible. She's being honored at the ASOL annual meeting next week, so if you're going to that, try to go to her ceremony. She was a little bit of inspiration for why I decided to look into this. So the tribunal itself lasted for, another thing to mention about the attorneys. Japan did not respond. The organizing committee reached out and said, would you like to send someone to serve as the defense attorney in this tribunal? And they did not answer, so 3 attorneys volunteered and they were going to represent impartially. So the tribunal itself lasted for 3 days. The prosecutors presented survivor testimony, expert testimony, as well as documentary evidence of the connection between the harms of the comfort women system and the Japanese government, in particular Emperor Hirohito. On the 4th day of the trial, the tribunal found all 9 of the main accused guilty of crimes against humanity in the form of rape and sexual slavery. The tribunal also found the Japanese government to be responsible for the harms committed against these women. The judgment went so far as to recommend that the Japanese government acknowledge its responsibility, apologize for its role, the role that it played, and contribute some type of reparation to the victims. It also called on governments of the Allied powers to declassify related documents to further be able to potentially adjudicate these crimes if ever that became an open opportunity. It also went on to request that the United Nations take on the responsibility to enforce what they had just announced. So that was the case study that I looked at. And then to kind of do a benefits drawbacks analysis as well as apply it to the situation at hand, there's a lot to think about. So initially looking at it in the context of the Yazidi women and what's going on here, One of the benefits would be that it avoids the political concerns of adjudicating these crimes in a jurisdiction where the Islamic State might still have hold, which was, of course, a consideration for the domestic courts as well as potentially an ad hoc tribunal. So that was one benefit. Another benefit is that it achieves global recognition. So the Women's Tribunal had widespread publicity. There were articles published about it all the time. It was recorded, it was photographed, there were countries from all over the world involved. So it definitely did get that widespread global recognition for the harms that these women endured. Another benefit is that it's relatively quick. Some of these things, some of these prosecutions take forever. They take decades. But when you look at this, it took 2 years for the organization and the establishment of it to happen, and then the trial itself was only 4 days. So when you're also thinking about what is going to be the toll on this community as they're going through this process, a 4-day trial is not going to be re-traumatizing. It's not going to have that same prolonged anxiety-inducing impact that a decades-long trial would have on these victims. So it might be a way to provide some form of closure without this endless, horrible, re-traumatizing effect that other trials have. Another really great benefit is that it does not preclude the other options. So some of the other options that I talked about would prevent other avenues from being pursued. So for instance, if an ad hoc tribunal is instated, the ICC will not prosecute. So then you're automatically having to choose between those two. But in this circumstance, this does not prevent the ICC, an ad hoc tribunal, domestic courts, anything. That being said, there must be procedures in place to ensure that the evidence used is not tainted in any way to prevent it from being used at further prosecutions. But we have a great example. So at the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal, they ensured that all of the evidence used was cataloged and registered. They also ensured that they went into it knowing that they were preparing for the possibility of a future prosecution. So by doing that, you're ensuring that this evidence is not tainted. We are hopefully going to have the opportunity to actually prosecute these individuals and to hopefully get criminal liability out of this. Some criticisms, which kind of goes along with that. There were major fairness concerns because Japan did not respond. That the tribunal tried to address that as best they could. They had defense attorneys arguing their case. A Japanese law firm sent briefs and evidence in support of the government's defense. The tribunal also took into account things like a decision from the Tokyo District Court that had denied Japanese government responsibility for Philippine women forced to serve as comfort women. So they did try to give weight to both sides and were impartial. And they tried to further safeguard fairness by ensuring that judges and attorneys were kept separate and all of that. There's no colluding, there's no corruption, or they tried their best. Another major downside, of course, is the lack of criminal accountability and enforcement. So, as I said, the tribunal, the women's tribunal, they had all of these great things that they wanted to come with it. They wanted reparations. They wanted accountability to be given to these women. There was no enforcement. So none of that actually ever came to be. So that's another issue that we would have to address, or just kind of accept that that's just how this type of avenue would end up coming to be. And then lastly, of course, there's acquiring evidence is still an issue. Will victims be interested in this type of avenue to justice because it's not actually criminal accountability? It is really public. I don't know that this community that's been very isolated and is very much focused on itself and not wanting to have that global interaction, I don't know that that's what they would want. So that's going to be my next step in my research. But there's also, of course, the question of the willingness of the international community to partake in something like this. That's really the only way that this works, is if we have global buy-in to create this mock trial and to go forth with it. And like I said, with the same hesitation on universal jurisdiction, there's not a guarantee that the global community will want to do any type of form of prosecution of anything related to the Islamic State, given that a lot of countries still see them as a threat to national security. So that's kind of where my research has ended at the moment. My next focus is going to be to look into what does justice mean to Yazidi women and the community, because I think that is critical to determine what the actual ideal approach is going to be to prosecution or not prosecution. Do we just want transitional justice? Do we just want to move forward and forgive and forget and move past this so they don't have to relive all the trauma? So that's going to be something that I focus on next. And then once I figure out what does justice mean to these women and to this community, I'm going to figure out if the mock trial mechanism would achieve this form of justice for them. Questions and comments? Yes.
I had two questions. First is there something akin to, say, claim for fundamental rights violation in either Iraq or Syria, whereby the women could hold the state responsible for its failure to prevent these atrocities or torture?
So depending on like looking at the Genocide Convention, for instance, because Syria and Iraq are parties to that, that is going to be the state responsibility. So that's like, it seems like a really great avenue because they are parties to those treaties, but we can't get individual responsibility out of that. Does that answer your question?
Very clear.
Okay.
And the second one, just practically, how does universal jurisdiction work? Is the accused required to be within the territory of the nation which is exercising universal jurisdiction? And a follow-up to that, could then possibly a claim be filed under something like the Alien Tort Statute if accused is within the territory?
Yeah, so the ATS is actually definitely used. So the US does have a universal jurisdiction statute that we are allowed to exercise it, so that the ATS does come into play with that. But the answer to your first part of your question, it depends on the state, the country. So every state has a different statute of how they're allowed to exercise universal jurisdiction. So that would just depend on whether or not they explicitly state it must be. Typically no, is going to be my answer. Most countries, or they somehow get this person transferred to their territory. So it's a little, that's also a controversial part of it. Yes.
Thank you so much for such interesting presentation. So my first question is, according to your knowledge, is Iraq, maybe not Syria, but Iraq has attempted to be a part of ICC or any application for that?
At this moment, no.
Okay, and in your research, did you deal with due diligence responsibility, maybe for Iraqi army or Christian regions army or anything like that, just a cause of misjustice?
I actually have not looked into that, but that's a really good point. I actually read something this morning that triggered my thoughts on that, so that's really, I'm going to definitely look more into that. Yeah, because there was an army in place that was supposed to be kind of guarding the community in the Sinjar region, and then they heard that the Islamic State was about to come in, and they left. And they did not alert the community. So there could very well be something there, and a responsibility that could come with that.
I'm glad that those women were able to hold Japan government accountable. And my question is that, do you think that in the near future we can expect a lawsuit against the US government for escalating the conflict in those regions?
Potentially. I mean, so there are definitely investigations into that. You're talking about into this conflict?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So the issue is, of course, we're not party to the Rome Statute, so the ICC can't really get jurisdiction over what we did. And then also because these other countries in the region are also not party, they, again, can't really gain access to look into it. And also because we are a member of the Security Council, that also kind of precludes another avenue to getting involved in that. And aside from, the ICJ could potentially look into it, but another state would have to bring that case, and I'm not sure that any state would want to do that. So my answer, I think, would be probably not, but I think that there's a case to have for that, for sure.
For the next research focus on the women and community members one, have you thought about or already started on your methods of how to?
So there is Georgetown Law has an International Human Rights Institute, and they're doing a lot of work with Yazidi women. So I am definitely trying to get into contact with them to reach out. I'm also going to talk to our lovely alum here. But yeah, so I really do want to try to speak to women who have actually gone through this and who are survivors of this to see what they themselves would want. I have also found some articles and interviews with them and other sources that have talked about similar issues. Yes, it's been kind of a thought process of looking at it.
You mentioned that you're going after individual prosecutions. I'm just kind of curious, have you ever toyed with the idea of expanding beyond the Islamic State of people who can be responsible? For instance, I know that organized criminal groups in the Mediterranean tend to facilitate and help operate these operations. So is that a realistic possible situation where you can prosecute members of those groups?
Yeah, for sure. That definitely goes beyond. So I think my initial scope was looking at the institution of the slave market and the fact that they're capturing these women and placing them initially into this system. But people that are guilty belong in it and continue to have it operate are definitely guilty. This is not true.
What do you think about risk associated with talking about sexual violence crimes? For example, in places where there is no a robust response for victim assistance. So, yes, for example, in these places, what is happening with the health protection and justice system with actually not working over there, and at the same time we are making for justice.
Yeah, definitely. So there are some organizations that are on the ground where these women are refugees essentially, and they are working through how to process what they've been through, giving them physical and mental and medical care. But beyond that, the reason why I also chose to propose this mock trial mechanism is because they have precedent for dealing with sex crimes and for dealing with victims of these crimes and how to handle it. Okay, how do we ensure that these victims are giving testimony in a way that is not triggering, that is not re-traumatizing. So this format kind of has a basis already put in place for how to handle this type of really sensitive, really delicate situation. But that is definitely, I mean, if by some miracle we could get enforcement for something like this and we want to state reparations and all those things, then we could get better aid for these women to help them kind of become more, heal more from the experience that they went through.
First of all, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I'm myself a Kurd. Yazidis are ethnically Kurdish. Religiously, they carry out the traditions of very ancient religion that predates both Christianity, Islam, and other monotheistic religions. And they have been victimized terribly throughout the history by both their own communities, by the other states that they live in. So bringing up their cause here, I am speechless, honestly, so thank you. And thank you for you guys for your attention, because this goes with you all, because as we all see, all these systems are designed for the states to use. International law basically is a political law, unfortunately. What victims can benefit is from attention from you and from researchers like Professor here. And what I was going to say, in order to trigger this attention for gaining the political support and using youth programs, for instance, what needs to be done on the ground? What are responsible?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you just said. People talking about it, people getting angry, people putting pressure on their governments to get involved. That is exactly what we needed. I mean, we would have to petition the U.S. to be like, there is an NGO out there that is starting this movement, and they want to put forth this mock trial mechanism because of the horrors that took place here. So we want you to buy into, they're looking for countries' support, and we are trying to get that. So we have to put so much pressure on our government, people from other countries who have to do the same. So definitely it's an uphill battle for sure, but it's a worthy cause for that. So.
with the example of the freedom comfort zone, how you see either advantages or challenges where we're kind of looking at a case here with two, I think what we can categorize as non-state actors, if we consider the Islamic State no longer as a true state actor. Do you think that presents opportunities, or is it that getting additional buy-in from traditional states is going to be a large barrier?
So I think it's kind of double-edged sword a little bit. So I think whereas looking at the case study, there may have been more obstacles because you had the potential political issues of getting involved with addressing the state and choosing state responsibility. Whereas here, the drawback is going to be, do they still pose a threat to our national security? And that's going to be really what holds countries back from getting involved. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming.